Your morality is not a choice. Your moral compass is physical hardware installed in your skull, and it can be switched off, without warning, without your consent, by something as small as a tumor or a piece of flying iron. Damage, the hardware morality, gone. Right now, a perfectly intelligent person somewhere in the world is committing an act they feel absolutely zero guilt about. Not because they were raised badly, not because they chose to be cruel, but because a tiny piece of brain tissue stopped functioning. There is a question neuroscientists have wrestled with for over a century. If your brain dictates your morality, can anyone truly be held responsible for the evil they commit? That answer, which I will reveal before this video ends, will change the way you see justice, guilt, and maybe yourself. In the next few minutes, you will discover the one brain region that acts as your moral on-off switch. The man whose catastrophic accident proved it in 1848, and why some of the most dangerous people on Earth are not evil by choice. They are broken by biology. Hardware broken, soul missing. September 13, 1848. A 25-year-old railroad foreman named Phineas Gage is tamping explosive powder into rock in Cavendish, Vermont. His crew considers him the best foreman they have ever worked with. Responsible, calm, precise under pressure. Then an accidental detonation sends a 13-pound iron rod, 5 feet long and over an inch in diameter, directly through his skull. It enters below his left cheekbone and exits through the top of his head, landing nearly 80 feet away. And here is the part that still disturbs every neuroscientist who studies this case. Phineas Gage does not die. He sits up minutes after the accident. He speaks coherently to the people around him. He walks to the cart that carries him to a doctor. His memory is intact. His language is perfect. His intelligence, by every measure available to 19th century physicians, is completely unaffected. But the man who survived the accident was not the man who walked into work that morning. His doctor, John Martin Harlow, documented the change with clinical precision over the following months. Gage became impulsive, vulgar, and incapable of following through on any plan. He showed no remorse for how his actions affected others. He drifted between jobs, relationships, and cities for the remaining 12 years of his life. His closest friends and family said it simply and chillingly: Gage was no longer Gage. What the iron rod destroyed, science would not fully understand for another 150 years, but it was pointing, with terrible accuracy, directly at the part of your brain that makes you who you are, and what it silently does for you every single day. The next chapter reveals exactly what that part is. But here is what nobody told you about Phineas Gage. The physicians who documented his transformation had absolutely no explanation for it. They knew a rod went in, a personality came out different, and nothing in between made scientific sense. That mystery stayed unsolved for 145 years. Then, in 1994, neurologist Antonio Damasio did something remarkable. Using modern brain imaging reconstruction, he traced the exact trajectory of the rod through Gage's preserved skull and mapped the specific tissue destroyed. The region, the orbitofrontal cortex, a small section of the prefrontal cortex sitting just above your eye sockets, intricately connected to both your emotional centers and your rational decision-making circuits. This structure, roughly the size of your thumb, is your brain's moral processing center. It integrates emotional memory with current choices. It is the interface between feeling and deciding. Damage it, and you retain your full intelligence, your memories, your language, your surface personality. But something essential vanishes. You lose the ability to feel the weight of your own choices. If the idea that your entire sense of right and wrong lives in a thumb-sized piece of tissue is making you uncomfortable right now, good. That means your OFC is working exactly as it should. If this kind of deep exploration is resonating with you, hit like and subscribe, because we are just getting started. What I am about to show you in the next segment goes deeper, because the science of how morality actually feels in your body will disturb you in the best possible way. Now stop and think about the last time you felt genuinely guilty. Not just the intellectual awareness that you did something wrong, the actual physical sensation of it, the tightness in your chest, the heaviness in your stomach, the way your thoughts keep looping back, That feeling is not weakness. That feeling is a biological alarm system, and it runs directly through your orbitofrontal cortex. Antonio Damasio called this the somatic marker hypothesis. The idea is this: your body keeps a running log of every emotionally significant experience you have ever had. When you face a moral choice, your brain rapidly cross-references your entire emotional history and produces a gut response, a somatic marker, before your conscious reasoning even starts. Your gut feeling is your moral memory, speaking before words can form. Think of a moment you knew something was wrong before you could explain why, before the argument formed in your head, before the words came. That instant, physical knowing. That is your OFC firing, scanning thousands of emotional memories in milliseconds and translating them into a feeling in your body. Patients with OFC damage lose this system entirely. They can describe moral rules with perfect accuracy. Ask them whether betraying a friend is wrong, and they say yes, obviously, but in the actual moment of decision, the alarm does not sound. No gut feeling, no weight, no pull. The knowledge of right and wrong exists in their minds, perfectly preserved. The experience of it is completely gone. Knowing without feeling equals nothing, and that is precisely the gap where moral behavior collapses. But the next chapter shows you what this looks like in the scanned brains of real people. And the science is far more disturbing than the philosophy. What I am about to tell you sounds like it belongs in a thriller novel. But it is peer-reviewed neuroscience replicated across multiple independent institutions. When researchers at the University of Wisconsin scanned the brains of convicted psychopaths and compared them to neurotypical subjects, they found something that deserved front-page headlines around the world. The connections between the orbitofrontal cortex and the amygdala were physically, measurably, structurally reduced. The amygdala is your fear and empathy center. The OFC is your moral decision-making center. In psychopaths, the neural highway connecting these two regions, the pathway that carries emotional signal into moral reasoning, is visibly compromised. Reduced volume, reduced white matter connectivity, not a metaphor, not a personality type, a neurological, physical, measurable difference. Now you might reach for comfort by assuming this only applies to violent criminals locked away in maximum security prisons. But research by Oxford neuroscientist Kevin Dutton suggests psychopathic traits exist on a spectrum, and roughly 1 in 100 people carry clinically significant levels in certain professions. Corporate executives, surgeons, lawyers, politicians. Rates are considerably higher than average. These are people functioning in society. Charming, accomplished, capable, with an OFC amygdala connection that processes other people's pain as essentially irrelevant data. As Immanuel Kant built the entire architecture of moral philosophy on rational duty, he never imagined that the capacity for that reasoning might itself be structurally deficient. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. But what if the brain physically cannot generate that reasoning? That is exactly what the next segment proves, with a gambling task that exposed the truth. But here is where it gets personal, and I mean that literally. Damasio tested his somatic marker hypothesis with a deceptively simple experiment called the Iowa gambling task. Patients with OFC damage and healthy control subjects were each given 4 decks of cards. 2 decks were secretly rigged to offer high short-term rewards but catastrophic long-term losses. 2 were set up for modest but reliable gains. Healthy subjects began avoiding the dangerous decks before they could consciously explain why. Their skin conductance, a physiological measure of emotional arousal, would spike every time their hand moved toward a bad deck. Their bodies knew the danger before their conscious minds identified it. OFC patients never developed this physical warning system. They kept returning to the losing decks even after verbally identifying which decks were rigged. They knew. They said it out loud, and then reached for them anyway. Because knowing something is wrong and feeling that it is wrong are 2 completely different neurological processes, and only one of them actually changes behavior in the moment of choice. You can recite every moral rule and still feel absolutely nothing. This is what makes OFC damage so quietly terrifying. There is no visible symptom, no dramatic sign. The person can look you in the eye, hold a sophisticated conversation, and internally process your needs, your trust, your vulnerability as irrelevant information. Damasio called it a dissociation between knowing and feeling, and it is not a small distinction. It is the entire difference between a person you can trust and one you cannot. Now forget what you assumed about what makes someone dangerous, because the next chapter introduces cases where perfectly ordinary people became unrecognizable almost overnight. Here is where the story takes a genuinely dark turn, because Phineas Gage was not an anomaly. The medical literature is filled with cases of what neurologists now call acquired sociopathy. People who were, by all documented accounts, good and decent human beings who suffered OFC damage and emerged as someone fundamentally unrecognizable. There is the well-documented case of a patient referred to in research as EVR, a successful professional, a loving husband and father, described by everyone in his life as responsible, kind, and steady. He had a benign tumor removed from his frontal lobe in the early 1980s. The surgery was textbook successful. His IQ afterward tested in the superior range, but his life collapsed with astonishing speed. He made catastrophic financial decisions. His marriage disintegrated. He lost job after job, not because he lacked ability, but because he could no longer feel the consequences of his choices before making them. Damasio tested him extensively. EVR could analyze any situation with impressive clarity and list pros and cons with articulate precision. He understood every social and moral rule governing the scenarios presented to him. Perfect analysis, zero feeling. The lights were fully on. No one was home. Damasio called it knowing without feeling, perhaps the most precise clinical description of moral collapse in the scientific literature. As philosopher David Hume argued centuries before brain scanning existed, reason is, and ought only to be the slave of the passions. Without emotional input, reason alone cannot navigate moral terrain. And what comes next? It is a single case so specific, so perfectly documented, so deeply disturbing. Our court of law had to reconsider everything it believed about guilt. If you thought that was disturbing, you are not ready for this. In 2002, a 40-year-old man in Virginia, a schoolteacher with no criminal history, married, respected in his community, with a spotless record spanning his entire adult life, began exhibiting deeply disturbing behavior that appeared to emerge from nowhere. He started collecting child pornography. He made inappropriate advances toward his stepdaughter. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to a rehabilitation program. The night before he was due to report, he went to an emergency room complaining of severe headaches. A brain scan revealed an egg-sized tumor pressing directly on his right orbitofrontal cortex. The tumor was surgically removed. Gone. His inappropriate urges disappeared completely. He returned home. He resumed his marriage. He went back to teaching. He was, by every account, the person he had always been before. Then, months later, the urges began returning. Another scan. The tumor had regrown in the same location. Another surgery. The urges disappeared again. His morality toggled on and off in direct correlation with the tumor's presence and removal. This case, documented in the journal Neurocase by researcher Russell Blanton and colleagues, became a landmark reference in both neuroscience and criminal jurisprudence. Because it presented a question no courtroom was architecturally designed to answer. If a tumor produces the behavior, if removing the tumor removes the behavior, who exactly is guilty? The man, the tumor, the biology that generated it. The line between illness and evil became impossible to locate. This is not philosophy. This is documented, published medical fact. And the next chapter reveals that this is not limited to rare tumors. It happened to thousands of people, all at once. Now stop and think for a second. Every case so far has been a single individual. One man, one rod, one tumor. But what happens when this damage occurs at scale? Research published in Neuropsychology examined combat veterans who had sustained traumatic brain injuries, specifically to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the region that includes and overlaps with the orbitofrontal cortex. These veterans, prior to their injuries, scored completely normally on every standardized measure of moral reasoning. After the injury, their willingness to endorse harmful actions against innocent people increased measurably. War brain damage morality altered, not because combat had desensitized them emotionally, not because they wanted to feel differently, but because the physical infrastructure of moral sensitivity had been structurally compromised at the neurological level. Researcher Michael Koenigs demonstrated that VMPFC patients were significantly more likely to endorse utilitarian harm, sacrificing one innocent person to save 5. In scenarios that triggered visceral resistance in healthy subjects, they reasoned their way past the emotional barrier that normally enforces moral limits. Logic without feeling, calculation without conscience. And here is the part that should genuinely disturb you. Many of these veterans were never formally diagnosed with neurological damage to this region. They returned to civilian life, to families, to neighborhoods, carrying invisible structural changes to the very region that governs how they treat the people around them. Invisible damage to invisible hardware with very visible human consequences. The next segment is the one that kept researchers up at night, because it connects everything we have covered to the one question I opened with, and the answer is not comfortable. Let me pause here, because what comes next changes the entire picture. In 2011, neuroscientist David Eagleman published research showing that across a 2-decade review of criminal cases, dozens of instances of violent and antisocial behavior had been directly linked to verifiable brain abnormalities. Tumors, strokes, lesions, structural differences, most frequently in the orbitofrontal cortex and its connected regions. And the legal system has slowly, uncomfortably, begun to respond. Defense attorneys now routinely request brain imaging as evidence in criminal trials. Neuroscience testimony is appearing in courts from the United States to Europe, and judges are being forced to answer the question that philosophy has debated for centuries but never had to rule on. If the biology commands the behavior, can we punish the person? Think about what this means in full. If your OFC is intact, you feel guilt, remorse, and empathy. Society holds you responsible for your choices. If it is damaged by accident, disease, or birth, those feelings simply do not generate. You are not choosing to ignore them. They do not exist for you. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi death camps and built an entire philosophy around human freedom, wrote, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response." But Frankl's space, that gap between impulse and moral decision, may not exist for everyone. For some people, the neurology that creates that space is broken, and society has been systematically punishing people for hardware malfunctions they never chose to have. Here is what I want you to think about. Do you believe brain damage should be a legal defense for crime? Comment hardware if you think biology can override responsibility. Comment choice if you believe free will holds regardless. I want to see which side you land on, because the final chapter answers the question I opened this video with, and it will change how you see yourself. So here is the answer. The question I opened with: can anyone truly be held responsible for the evil they commit if their brain's moral hardware is damaged or absent? The honest answer from neuroscience is deeply uncomfortable. Moral responsibility is inseparably linked to the health of your brain. Phineas Gage did not stop caring about people because he chose to. His brain stopped generating the experience of caring. The Virginia schoolteacher did not select his behavior. A tumor rerouted the circuitry of his choices and then restored them when removed. EVR could describe every rule of decent behavior with flawless articulation and follow none of them in practice because feeling had been surgically separated from knowing. And here is what all of this means for you. Right now, with a healthy, intact orbitofrontal cortex, your empathy is not a personality trait. It is not a sign of emotional fragility. It is not something to suppress in the name of toughness or productivity. Your empathy is hardware, and it is rarer, more fragile, and more extraordinary than most people ever understand. We live in a culture that often rewards those who feel the least, who make decisions without emotional weight, who treat people as instruments rather than ends. But the neuroscience says clearly, those people are not stronger. They are missing something small and physical and irreplaceable, sitting just above your eyes. Antonio Damasio, whose work unlocked this entire field, put it best: we are not thinking machines that feel. We are feeling machines that think. Your morality lives in your hardware. It is biological, fragile, and precious. Treat it, and every person you encounter, accordingly. If you made it this far, comment orbitarfrontal to prove you are one of the rare minds that truly wants to understand what makes us human. The truth is stranger than anything you could make up. Every morning you wake up with a brain quietly doing something extraordinary, scanning your past, your values, your emotional memory, and producing a feeling about how to treat the people around you. That feeling is not guaranteed. It is hardware. Biological, physical, fragile hardware running in a structure you cannot see and rarely think about. Phineas Gage lost himself in the fraction of a second it took an iron rod to pass through his skull. A tumor the size of an egg turned a devoted schoolteacher into someone unrecognizable, and then back again when it was removed. Veterans came home carrying invisible wounds to the very structure that governs human decency. The capacity to feel guilt is the most underrated human ability. We live in a world that celebrates ruthlessness and calls it strength. That rewards those who feel the least about the consequences of their choices and their power. But the science tells a different story. Feel more, not less. Your conscience is not a limitation. It is the most sophisticated moral processing system in the known universe, doing its quiet work every single day to make you someone worth knowing. Protect it. Feed it with empathy, with reflection, with genuine curiosity about other people's inner lives, and never be ashamed of it. The truth is stranger than anything you could make up.